Sup Shredders, my name is Logan aka Spiderhands and welcome to an SP Reacts where today we got ourselves the entirety of an album from an act named Sorin Sage titled Bloodthirst. And if we switch over to here, we got ourselves the album on Spotify here. We got the art up on the screen looking very foreboding there. This is my first time checking out their work. We're going to listen through this album from start till finish and we're going to hear what we think. Bloodthirst, let's go, let's do it. Track number 1. Fantastic panning of those keys. Adds further rhythmical context to those basses. I mean, it's heavy. Great use of choirs over top to make it sound huge. Great use of double time now. Great use of that vibrato with that squeal. But the guitar harmonies are so complex. I suppose they'll be tapping, wouldn't it? I mean, the synths. Those pads on top of those elements are just... I don't know why I wasn't expecting machine gun kicks as a natural development. Really beautiful neoclassical harmonies on those twin leads. It's crazy to think we're not even halfway through this. And I'm enjoying my time with it. I mean, the thing tying it all together is the tempo at this point. As well as a lot of the tone sticks and timbres to their own instruments. Great return. It reminds me a lot of the music from the mid-2000s. Like Bullet for Valentine and stuff like that. I love it. Some Protesta Hero mixed in. Do we switch from triplets to 16s then? No. Ah, change of meter. sneak into his machine gun kicks back in. Great transfer rhythmically back to the strings here with those staccatos. Oh, that's... Oh. So wide on the sides. Such a gentle finish to this track. Like, it seems like it's its own album within itself, you know what I mean? And it just transfers seamlessly into Bloodthirst. Oh, into Sanctuary, should I say, track number 2. Nice. I mean, to be fair, I mean, in each of these post-track sections, I'm going to be providing a sort of a mini sort of conclusion of, you know, lyrics and vocals all the way through to studio production, as well as an overall analysis of the album at the end, including applicable constructive critique, and then finally my general thoughts from a listener's perspective. But first of all, what do we think Bloodthirst, the first track, is about? Clearly, this is a long-form piece which is meant to sort of get you into the zone of what the album is about. It is instrumental, so you're left into a position where you kind of have to figure things out for yourselves, and I think that's totally fine. I would say, given the plethora of different themes, progressions, ideas that we have throughout this 13-minute track, which is completely warranted, it's a longer song. You need to have compositional diversity through it, that it's going through all the different interpretations and moods and sort of like patterns of that Bloodthirst, all the different stages of that. And I assume potentially the rest of the album afterwards is further elaborating on those things. We have choirs in different parts, but they're mainly singing melodies or harmonies there, as opposed to trying to be a kind of a forward-thinking kind of narrative over top of it. You're basically, as a listener, left in a position where you're just there to sort of appreciate the musicality of literally everything else. So I think with an absence of vocals aside from the choirs, which I think add a sort of spirituality to it, a kind of a fancy sort of mysticism to it, you're left with the 13 minutes of a wide variety of different synthetic guitar, bass, and drum textures, strings, pads, keys, etc. It's incredibly lush and varied. To try and discuss the entire 13 minutes and like it's just, there's a lot to remember and a lot to take in, and I think this is definitely a song where, because of its form factor and length alone, you're probably going to need multiple listens to really pick up the nuances. There were obviously more sort of prominent parts within the composition. There weren't verses and choruses because it was through composed, you know. But you had different stages and chapters which were put forward by Sorin Sage throughout this work. The main instruments you had were, and for one, the guitars, the distorted kind of new metalish kind of like, it reminded me of a lot of the harmonized dual guitar rhythm parts, string skip stuff, and melodies that you had within the late 2000s, early 2010s with that kind of metal that was going on then and still is nowadays. It's just so wonderfully colorful. We have a variety of different chugged power chord elements there. And at other points there, we have a freneticism and a speed with the picked notes there, with really interesting sort of palm muted kind of vibrato, some kinds occasionally, some really interesting articulations there, some great sort of tapped leads over top in certain sections there that add a nice counterpoint to some of those guitar elements we have there. But it's like the guitar knew when to go a bit slow with the palm mutes, and then knew when to push forward with some of the faster leads there. We had some really quick sort of sweepy elements as well there that were virtuosic, and ultimately the guitar parts were well fleshed out, incredibly colorful, lots of sort of metallic and sort of like neoclassical stylings with those shred parts. But the guitars were a sometimes thing. You had the drums there, which were wonderfully atmospheric in their approach there. Granted, you could do gallops there and some machine gun double kicks occasionally. We went to like 30-second territory. We had luxurious kind of fills, and we were very adept with our sort of quarters, eighths, triplets, and sixteenths across the board. But we allowed things to float as well. It wasn't just that we had a tight drum performance that was comfortable with half time and normal time and double time occasionally. It was that we knew not to have it, so to allow things to sort of like resonate on top. The bass parts underneath, I think the bass was relatively subtle, at least the bass guitar was subtle in the most part. You know, it definitely wasn't subtle at the beginning there, when you had that kind of throbbing at the beginning, like that pulse, that writhing there. And it's very intense, like it's immediately affecting, and just the panning of the keys as well after that, the way they're kind of so delicate and fragile on the right but so kind of like pretty sounding at the same time. It's just fantastic. And the keys a lot of the time were inhabited a part of the frequency spectrum that those choir vocals are in. So things just kind of shone up above, especially in the parts where you had the guitars in the mid-range and the drums and bass kind of pummeling the lower parts. What I really did dig though is how in tune the synths and string elements were with those guitar parts. There were some elements where the guitars were by themselves, but other parts where you had occasional soaring elements and everything was in rhythmical unison there. And you had these wonderful harmonies going on there, the frequency spectrum being really well fleshed out. And it just kind of flew by, and you had these less kind of like solid elements there, these floatier parts that intermingled with the kind of chugs, and it was just dope. It was really cool. But the strings had their own sort of like personality and purpose within the track as well. They'd pepper things and call and respond and do other parts there and amongst the guitars and separate to them. Like we understood both how to get these sort of orchestral symphonic elements to both work with the guitar and how to sort of step away from them and be their own beast. Especially in that last part, that last minute and a half or so, something along those lines, where it's just wonderfully, it's luxurious with the response of those strings there. The wonderful chords and the interpretation of those are so warm and soothing, especially in comparison to some of the heaviness and speed and kind of like calamity that you have with some of those guitar, bass, and drum parts earlier. And especially when those choirs soar and you get the wonderful kind of head voice on them, it's wonderful. It's so pretty sounding. It's just such a contrast to some of the heavier parts beforehand. I should note there that I like the way that the piano is played in that midsection as well. You know, through composed doesn't necessarily need to be completely the same intensity the entire time. And for it to come down in that midpoint, as well as in other parts, and to have a sense of compositional dynamic range, as well as production-based dynamic range, is really special. Granted, I think in part it was because of how we approach things like the compression, EQing, the reverbs and delays and stuff like that, as well as the panning decisions. But ultimately, yeah, no, it was just great for things to come down a bit, especially because it is a longer track, and giving the listeners a moment just to sort of absorb what's happened prior is a smart move. But I think those kind of synthetic, kind of industrial elements, especially at the start, combined with the choir elements, the strings, the pads, etc., and those leads and those kind of fizzier elements, plus again the fundamentals of the bass, drums, and guitar, will satisfy people who like metal from a variety of different genres. I think there's a lot in here for everyone. I think, you know, the absence of vocals isn't a detriment. There are so many different lead elements that I don't think you're missing out on much, like without having vocals within this. I think it's thoroughly open to interpretation, and there's so many different moods and ambiances and experiences within this one track alone that you've got a lot to appreciate and get lost in. And I'm genuinely looking forward to listening through the rest of the album, if I'm honest, get off of this first track alone, and that does not always occur. Sometimes I am dreading the rest of the album. Thematically, it's minor leaning, but there's so much variety harmonically, without needing to go to extensions or overcomplicating things in a sort of like a jazzy kind of emotionally nuanced way. We've got those major and minors and maybe some like occasional chromatics, but it's still very well behaved actually diatonically for the most part. You have some augmented sharp fifths occasionally, some of those chords are a bit of kind of sass and stuff like that, but it's definitely for effect in those moments. Yeah, honestly, just really well-rounded piece there that I feel like I've said a lot about it, but also I don't feel like I've done it justice, which is why I'm trying to sort of like not talk too much during the listening parts, but just kind of mention stuff when I can so that I don't miss it. Yeah, just phenomenal performance on the drums as well, though. Just the tightness of those machine gun kicks, the fills, etc. is just tremendous. And my understanding is that they are using virtual instruments, but like nonetheless, it's just fantastic. Really well composed. It takes a lot of kind of like, it takes a lot of skill and finesse to be able to make stuff like this, sincerely. It's very mature and sophisticated. The studio recording, mixing and mastering is fantastic as well. It's not just the fact that things are well leveled and spread throughout the stereo field. There's no weird resonances in frequency spectrum. Things are well filtered and things have dynamic range. You know, or tracks aren't the same loudness. The frequency spectrum is well fleshed out from a composition device as well, so things didn't need to argue too much. Nice and loud, bit of pumping, bus compression, limiting is handled. And I just like how interesting the variety of instruments are and how they've been put forward in this piece. And most importantly, there was no filler in that long form track. That is probably one of the longest tracks I've ever reviewed, and I enjoyed my time through it, so well done. We have Sanctuary, track number 2. Really compelling synth arpeggio. Maybe we do have extensions, maybe I'm tripping. Oh, well there we go. Yeah, that's extensions. Harmonically. Great push there, adjustment of feel. Great to hear the bass by itself. Cool chromatic there. I use the hammer-ons and the lofts. Great to have an alternate lead. Yep, embracing the idiom. Great return. Very use of symmetry with the guitar takes as well. Attention to those guitar chords at the end as well. Fantastic sort of like follow on from Bloodthirst. You know, a far smaller form factor, but Sanctuary, I think, is a track where we're basically, you know, finding a sense of self, I suppose. Maybe we're trying to sort of like, because the track does kind of go back on itself a little bit structurally. There are some riffs that are repeated in a shorter form factor. I think maybe we're trying to find a sense of sort of stability or equilibrium. There's this kind of like gothic romanticism to it, with especially the strings and a lot of the other layers and how they come together. But ultimately, it just shows that Sorin Sage can handle both a longer form track, and even though 5 minutes is still quite long for a track in this day and age, still like a shorter form factor one with ease. As far as I can tell, sort of structurally, again, due to a lack of absence of vocals, like you do have the choirs coming back here, but they're more of an instrumental layer. It's more straightforward in terms of the structure. But again, we do return to like kind of some of those intro riffs, have a similar kind of pattern or precedent with the kind of double timing of things. Ultimately, we have a wide range of different guitar, bass, drum, synth, and key elements there. But I do dig that we have slightly different tones and textures, and I liked again those extensions that we had with the arpeggios at the start of the piece there. Those kind of plucks there on those harps or something like that were really sweet sounding. It was very sort of mysterious, I suppose. It added a bit of nuance there emotionally. And as we kind of have those additional kind of synthetic layers, you know, push forward, and the drums are like filtered in a way where they're very sort of like low key and understated, you feel like you're getting into something a lot heavier, but just the atmosphere, you know, the tension is palpable at that stage there. It's just nice to sort of build without it being too blunt. To be fair, you've got that hiss of the guitar coming up in those like first 30 and about 35-second mark to kind of let you know that you're building into something, but then it hits you like a train. As a slower tempo, you can definitely feel like a more sort of like steady pace to this one there with some of the offbeat kind of like snare patterns and stuff like that. And I think that's totally fine. There's a kind of rigidity to some of the flow of the parts there that I think is counteracted in part due to the hammer-ons and pull-offs and legato technique on those guitar elements. But I also do dig the fact that we're comfortable with the alternate palm muting kind of chugged elements there, as well as some like kind of very sort of tense chords and in the end parts there's some symmetrical guitar parts and different elements of the hook lines and stuff like that play different melodies and different rhythms there, and they're differentiated in the same way that when you have those minor third intervals, you know, they differentiate and get wider and thinner, I think, in part because when they're the same idea, they kind of go towards the middle, they kind of phase a little bit. When they're kind of doing different notes, they spread because they're different. It was cool to hear the bass by itself. It's got an unusual tone, but I don't necessarily mind it. I still think it has a place within the mix, and maybe it's just not trying to be too thick and full to compete with some of the harsher, heavier elements, like, again, the drum parts. We have a similar kind of approach to the Bloodthirst, except in a far lesser amount of time there, around the 2:45 mark, where we go back down again to play some sort of like pedal or octave notes. And I think it's just a great come down, especially as we've already basically, again, had a song around the 2:45 mark. I wonder if this is something that's going to continue for the rest of the tracks within this record. I wouldn't mind necessarily if that was the case. It'd be a great way to sort of like kind of tie things together, I suppose, two halves of the coin. But it's just how wonderfully textured and varied things are there. We're so adept at kind of building and adding things without it being too abrasive or overwhelming. I also dig the fact that, again, I mentioned in the first track that I wasn't aware of as many chromatics. I think there were some parallel majors, so some fun note choices there where we're kind of using an unexpected note before the transitions of those choruses, and I like that. I think it's a fun concept. I think the slides as well and some of the tapped parts were kind of neat, and the guitar solo that we had as well there separate from those main rhythm riffs was good. It was nice to have that additional lead element there just to kind of push things forward and be like a mid-range resonance. You know, it's got such a fantastic tone with the choirs on top there, especially with our whole notes contrasting with some of the 8th, 16s and potentially 32nds of those drum parts. And so effectively as you kind of fade out the track, you're just in a position where you just had a really warm welcome and you feel very much at home within this track. The strings at the end are tense and dramatic there with the way they pepper up and down there, but it's a nice reiteration of some of the melodic motifs in the earlier part of the track, as well, again, as those like synth parts in the middle. They're kind of reflecting some of the elements beforehand. You just have different instruments repeating similar concepts so that it ties together and doesn't become too stale. But it doesn't let up. Honestly, again, it's another really well fleshed out 5-minute track where it doesn't overstay its welcome. The performance overall, things sound tight, and it combines both the more sort of like rock metal-y elements there, the traditional sort of big guitar, bass, and drums with the synthetic string and sort of symphonic layers really neatly. Thematically minor leaning, I assume probably the rest of the album will be that way. I don't imagine this to be a particularly major sounding positive track, even though there are occasional sort of parallel majors or sort of like chromatics. But ultimately, yeah, I think that suits the vibe really well. You know, the moment you start getting major leaning with metal, it starts to turn into power metal a lot of the time, especially at the speed of like Bloodthirst, for example. Ultimately, studio production, recording, mixing, mastering wise, again, I go back to that bass tone. I do quite like it. It's got an unusual sort of like tone, but sometimes when you're mixing music, you kind of need to find a way to niche it in. And sometimes you've got to do things with individual elements there to kind of alter them to make them behave a bit better. I think maybe if the bass had been too robust there, it would have just been too kind of like dominant in the low ends, and then it's sort of EQ or sort of like meter that a little bit. But no complaints on my part in regard to that. Ultimately, you can hear the different guitar, bass, drums, synth, string, key, like atmospheric elements all really neatly. The choirs resonate on top. And it's nice and consistent and sounds like it's well connected to Bloodthirst, their first track. They follow on from each other, and I feel like at this point I'm in safe hands. We'll go Afterlife of Ruin, track number 3. And instantly, distortion for kicks. I mean, it's really articulate guitar playing on top, and it has plenty of room to breathe. Yep, great adjustment there with the kicks. Great slowdown. It's like we've changed the speed to the kicks at this part. Oh. Are we adjusting things very, very, very slowly? We are. Interesting decision there. Yeah, I think that was a smooth transfer. That was nice. We haven't had that before. Has that got a swing groove to it, amongst the straight 4/4 of the piano parts? Ooh, nice. Now, I'm not entirely sure if I'm convinced by that drum tone at the end, but I do think it's an interesting, nice kind of like, adjustment, a different one, definitely to the main sort of like drum kit throughout the entirety of the album so far. So I think it's cool that we're playing with different tones and textures. But that was Afterlife of Ruin, track number 3. I would assume that Afterlife of Ruin is effectively maybe the sanctuary is like a false place where like maybe the place outside of it, that is your sanctuary within that afterlife. You've kind of found like a safe place within it. Maybe the Bloodthirst has left you to a point where you can't escape. You couldn't have had an alternate afterlife than that. I'm not quite sure, but anyways, it's interesting. This track at 6 minutes 51. You know, it's not by no means 13 minutes, but it's not 5, so there's a bit more heft to it. And I feel like it uses that real estate quite well there. I haven't really had a track yet where we've kind of faded out over a minute and gone into a key part. I kind of understand why we did that, because, you know, like, it might have been kind of awkward to just have suddenly bluntly gone into that piano part. So we're kind of taking it away slowly so the keys become more prominent over that time. And then you effectively have that drum kit come in, which we wanted to have with that interesting kind of swing kind of texture, that kind of bounciness to it, to allow us to kind of shimmy around that last minute or so. It's such a contrast to a lot of what we had prior, where like a lot of the straight 4/4, 8ths, quarters, 16ths, and 32nds, especially in like the sweepy parts in those solo sections earlier on in the piece. It makes me wonder, I think, whether there is going to be more variation there. Maybe it's trying to hint at an adjustment or a change within the album, a change in direction for the people associated. I'm not quite sure. But I think it's also, to be fair, we've had those electronic elements peppered throughout the album, so it's okay for us to sort of mess around with different kits too. Also, it's music, it's art, right? I think that generally the first sort of 4 minutes or so are what you'd kind of expect from this album at this first point, with a mixture of different sort of palm muted sort of power chords and string skip elements and like melodies and sort of twin guitar harmonies, dual guitar harmonies. I did really dig the expanded kind of guitar solo section. I just thought it was great to have more of that kind of like work between the lead guitars and the drums, especially when things spit up like that. But we also did notice they are welcome with the extremely quick stuff. We did slow down after a while and come back down. There was this kind of fast, slow kind of thing going on there, where we played with the expectations of the listener a little bit. Incredibly colorful from the bat though, a mixture of different tapped and slid kind of like lead guitar techniques over top of the bass and drums there. I think the choir as well joining in, or at least the strings there or something along those lines. But it's like it's a sometimes thing in that. But I think we're more trying to sort of approach a sense of heaviness that Bloodthirst had. And I think we even had some kind of subtle tremolo picked elements there as like a sub lead outside of the solo guitars around like the 2-minute mark, for example, as you have those really intense sort of almost like Trivium-ish or like Bring Me the Horizon kind of stuff going on there with different parts, like the choir for Bring Me the Horizon, twin guitars and Trivium. But having, as I mentioned, the drums be a bit more minimalist at first, but arguably, at least in comparison to complexity of rhythms with the kicks, to come in after that section where there's like a breakdown, the guitar slow down, and those kind of like those quick step kicks is just fantastic. Like change of focus in terms of the pace of things. And I think again around that 4.5 minute mark when we really started moving towards the keys, I think maybe at that point compositionally we weren't sure how to finish it. And that's that's an issue that I think a lot of people come across when they're writing albums is, okay, that was a really cool idea, but I just don't know how to finish it in a way that is maybe distinct from previous parts, or doesn't elicit the kind of feeling of change or in direction that we need to get through the rest of the album. The keys were a little bit more sort of fleshed out in this part, or at least like a little bit more sort of like directive in their approach there. Granted, we had the kicks come in with some interesting kind of trappy elements there, I think, with the electronic textures. And it was kind of nice to add that kind of feel to it, I suppose, in retrospect. It was mainly, I think, just to have the keys not be too much of a constant. There were some cool note choices though with the parallel major that we had in that last like round of notes before the finale of the piece there. It was almost like we were hinting at like a sense of hope potentially. Hey, I'm getting used to it. Like I'm listening back to the track, you know, between talking about things. I'm getting used to the kind of swing with the straight for the bounciness with that. It does make sense. I think that if we'd been quicker with some of the key parts and not played like 8th notes, if we tried to do 16ths, that's when it would have sounded sort of rhythmically abrasive potentially, or too busy. But that's totally fine. It's also just kind of interesting having like 5 seconds at the end of the track with nothing in it. It just kind of fades and you're just left with a blank space. You're not really sure what you're going into next. That isn't something we've had really with the previous tracks, especially Bloodthirst going straight into Sanctuary like that. But I kind of adore the fact that we're allowing a moment to pause and consider things, especially if you're not in the process of reviewing the album and you're just listening to it on your own. Ultimately, thematically, I think you've got that same minor leaning with a lot of the stuff we had earlier. They're maybe even working more. There weren't Phrygians, there weren't flat seconds in this. It was typically minor. But you had occasional critics, maybe to hint at things maybe improving a little for that or looking up a little bit. I'm not quite sure. Before the Dawn, maybe the Dawn is going to make things better. I'm not quite sure. You can only take what you can when things are instrumental, right? But ultimately, yeah, I just think having a gentler end to it kind of insinuates nuance. studio recording, mixing, and mastering. Similar comments to previous tracks. Things are well leveled in the stereo field and frequency spectrum. You could have. I think the electronic drums, were fine at the end with the piano. I think part of it is that you don't have some of the heaviness of those guitar and bass and drums, so therefore the electronic drums are a bit more sort of like forward in the mix there. But I think that, again, given the proficiency of the mixing in general throughout this album so far, I think that was clearly deliberate. That bounciness and punchiness was a sort of a known approach. But no issues in regards to post there. It's sounding great so far. It's been a good ride. I've enjoyed it. And I think I'm starting to get used to the way that we're writing music now. And it's just nice to maybe include new elements now before we kind of get to the halfway point there, just kind of elicit the feeling of, oh, there is going to be further range. It's not just going to be chug chugs the entire time. Not that I mind it, but others might, I'm not sure. But yeah, just if a final note, great automation of the volume on the fade out at that 4.5 minute mark there. It's just nice sort of use of volume automation there. But we've got Before the Dawn, track number 4. Is it in the same key signature throughout the album or like a similar one? I think it might be, eh? Great addition to the lead. Familiar territory. Harmonized pinches, nice. Great adjustment of flow here, man. We're doing some polymeter stuff, or some like meter changes there. It's triplet flow right now. Or is it 6/8? I think it might be 6/8. Yep. Okay, good job. Adjusting things at the halfway point. So that's an effective use depending on toms as well there, like you go around the place. That was fun. That was a new thing. Great adjustment of A and B sides with the guitars leading them over top. Now how we're going to finish this? Choirs come back in. I think it works well with the choir on the sides and the guitar in the center. Yeah. No, fantastic. We're leading into the only escape there. Alright. sensational. So that was Before the Dawn, track number 4. Really does kind of sound like we're building into something, especially at the end, going into the only escape. Maybe the dawn is the only way of escaping from the afterlife of ruin. I'm not quite sure. Again, being instrumental, you can put things together and kind of imagine as best you can. It's all good. Nonetheless, I'm appreciating the experience so far. At 8 minutes 55, as per the other tracks, there is no filler. It is a long piece, but I don't think it overstays its welcome. I will admit at this point that I'm starting to get used to the style of guitar playing that we're doing with the distorted sort of rhythm guitars, the kind of da-da-da-da-da-da, those kind of riffs. There's a lot of them in this album. I don't think it's a bad thing. I quite like it. I think there's only so much you can do, especially in longer form factor tracks, when you have similar elements there. We explored so many different riffs in Bloodthirst, as well as let alone Sanctuary and Afterlife of Ruin, that at this point, you've got the similar key signature. And again, I like it. This is not a criticism. This is me sort of elaborating on this track at this point from a listener's experience. I feel like if you like this music, you're going to continue listening through the rest of the album at this stage, is what I'm trying to sort of communicate. So ultimately, I feel like we're in a great place with this in terms of the tightness of those rhythm parts. It's why I was especially happy when I heard those sweep picks on either side, those harmonized sweeps. That was cool. We haven't had that before. And so I think what I'm trying to communicate is that I'm also looking for new things at this stage to appreciate. I thought that there was a really sort of like interesting synth tone at the start there, and the way it kind of ascended and descended was nice. And I think we had additional layers of that as well. It wasn't just one. There was maybe an echo going around the background or something like that, or there was like a sub lead there, and it was just very sort of like mystical and had this kind of fantasy, kind of dramatic kind of element to it. It was kind of spooky sounding as well. It kind of mirrored some of the extensions, sort of like out external triad ideas that we had like in tracks like Sanctuary and stuff like that. But we were very comfortable again coming in with those main sort of like guitar, bass, and drum parts. And I do appreciate that we had some moments where there was more speed or rhythmic emphasis on some of the external elements to the guitars. Like, again, we're very quick with our shred picking and stuff like that, as per Afterlife of Ruin, as well as a lot of the other tracks, including this one. It's just nice to have a more minimalist flow to the phrasing of the rhythmic elements there to allow other things to sort of cascade over top. Again, like the kind of fluffy, kind of staccato-ish kind of strings, kind of representing a different iteration of maybe the initial melodic motif that you had at the start there. We understand our fundamentals of music composition there. We're not leaving anything undesirable. And we allow points of like fills and like pauses, and like we have these 16th note tom patterns and stuff like that to lead us into parts there. It's not like it's uninteresting even when it is heavy with the guitars. There's a lot of movement and there's a sense of unpredictability with it, which I appreciate there. It's just good to have slowdowns and things speed up again, and just changes in the instrumental intensity as well as the actual sound itself. I thought the tremolo pick guitar parts around the 540 mark, as the guitars kind of had those palm muted parts and the drums kind of collaborated with those, was good. It sounded huge simply because of how well the frequency spectrum was fleshed out. And to have things kind of speed up again with the machine gun kicks or the gallops was totally fine, because you had that slowdown there to be able to appreciate things coming back up again before the dawn. I kind of interpret before the dawn being when the choir comes in at the end there, and then you've got those lead guitars dancing around in the center. And I just thought it was really pristine sounding with those leads, with the choirs there. It's a nice way to reintegrate back into the, the main sort of like construction of things with those guitar, bass, and drums to the final part, with a chord progression that's quite easy to follow along to and easy to sort of maintain, and sort of like it's a friendly, accessible rhythm. It's palatable, or a progression, should I say. It's not controversial by any means. It works. It's very functional. It's just that we took a while to get there to a relatively safe space and amongst the heaviness of it. And it just sounds massive because of the strings and the choirs and just the kind of tension and push that's incurred by everything culminating at the end. But it was just nice to have the choirs and lead before that final push to the finish. And for things to come down to that point then, for the choirs to really have precedence then, to be able to hear them in full as opposed to as like a sub lead or like an upper layer along a lot of the album so far. I think as a final note before I talk about the studio production side of things, it was just kind of cool to have like changes in meter going between some of the triplet patterns, the 4/4s, etc., just adjusting or adding beats to sort of bars and stuff like that. It was just that they were kind of there were call and responses and like other moments where things sort of spoke with each other, but it just made things a little bit kind of like static, even though there was so much speed to a lot of things. It just adjusting the feel and flow and cadence of things from an instrumental or rhythmical perspective can be quite exhilarating, quite nice. I mean, thematically, again, where our minor scales and keys are handled there, we had some interesting sort of like extensions notes, not quite the chromaticism we had in previous parts there, but that's totally fine as they're an occasional thing anyways, and not the main sort of event. Just the way that we stuck to that minor, we kept things relatively conservative when we needed to, when things were meant to sort of be more sort of euphoric or catchy, but at other points there we were happy to sort of explore different ideas, maybe some sort of like, again, some harmonic and melodic minors and some of the side sweet parts there, but ultimately, yeah, just we had the zeros when we needed to as well. Didn't overcomplicate things. Just great to have ranges to the complexity of different chord progressions and extensions in different parts, as well as in terms of how they're presented there, as well as with the tapped lead elements there being quite sort of like proficient there with the way that they kind of cascaded through those notes there. Ultimately, yeah, I think that part of what makes this album easy to listen to is because there aren't any super controversial chord progressions or kind of crazy, kind of quirky changes there. You kind of get lost in the mist of it, the ether of it. Studio production, record, mixing, mastering wise, generally typically happy with everything that I've heard so far. Again, similar comments, because it's all been sort of mixed and mastered as per. A lot of my comments are going to be similar to previous parts, but what I will note is that I just like the fact that we, in those moments of pause there, we had the choirs, as I mentioned, being more present. It shows that we understand how to compress things properly, how to level things properly, and also how to take things away and allow space for other things within the mix. So that's a really important thing. You don't just have everything the same loudness. You need to adjust the feel and presence of things to allow a main sort of focal point that's easier to follow along to. You need to help the listener as well as sort of make great sounding music. So ultimately, yeah, just continuously solid. I'm enjoying my time with this. We got track number 5, The Only Escape. Very cute sounding synth, actually. Like kind of unconventional, but it's new. I just like the amount of time it's taken to get to where it needs to. It's just not rushing, you know? What a different kind of groove we have with this one, eh? Yeah, honestly, I'm really digging this low-key nature to this piece. It's like they heard my feedback about getting used to things with Before the Dawn in real time, you know? See, I don't mind going back into distortion for various reasons. No, I think this is probably one of my favorite tracks. I like the lead into it. Oh, I don't know if I like how that harmonizes. It kind of works, but it's just very risque, isn't it? So that was The Only Escape, track number 5 off of the album Bloodthirst. Again, just another really solid effort. I think this track is more a calm commiseration or hope of an alternate to the Afterlife or Ruin that we're in. I genuinely feel like we tried to do something different with this one. I mean, clearly that's obvious. The track is mostly electronic synthetic elements, and I kind of dig that for a variety of reasons, which we're going to discuss. But I just think, when I think of The Only Escape and I compare it to the previous tracks that we've heard, it makes total sense. You know, it's 5 minutes 35, but because of the way it's structured with that extra 2 to 3 minutes, it's such a low-key contrast to the intensity of what we've had prior, that it's just you just kind of get lost in it, and you're just kind of in your happy place, I suppose, you know. It's so lush and filled with interesting sounds and sights to listen to, that you kind of want to like hear more of it. You have those keys come in immediately with like a cute kind of tone there that's like a little bit unconventional in a way that I think maybe there was like a drum kit at one of the end of the tracks that I wasn't totally sure about. But like this one just feels more natural to me. It kind of gives this kind of like cozy tone in a weird way. It kind of reminds me a lot of music from the 80s, like the kind of dance music from the 80s, especially when the drums come in. It's got that kind of chord note accent to it. But you've also got this like really wonderful sub bass underneath it where it just fills out the frequency spectrum really neatly. It sounds huge despite not being too in your face. And yeah, we kind of reiterate some of the main sort of like arpeggios and triad concepts in melody form. You know, like as we go along, we add further layers, but it doesn't really, it's like leveled in a way where it's not on your face or abrasive. And you've even got some kind of like vocal chops or something like that underneath it there, kind of like those kind of sounds there on the side, which are an occasional thing, but they're just a nice little bit of extra ear candy to kind of help you kind of carry you along. And you know, we switch the pattern of that and we adjust the speed of that as we go through it, but like 1.5 minutes of this track at the very least goes through quite quickly. You know, you're not missing anything. And as you kind of have the drums come in relatively like sort of like in a minimalist fashion there, it's a contrast. The contrast is basically the main word with The Only Escape here, where it's so well moderated there. it's kind of like wondering if it can step into the door. And when that quarter note groove does come in with those eighth notes, kicks, and sort of hi-hats and stuff like that, you know, in that around that 2-minute mark there, you have the reiteration of that initial theme. And it's just very kind of like fun to groove and nod your head along to. It's absent of a lot of the kind of harsher, grittier textures of the guitars and stuff like that you have earlier. So you're kind of feeling like this is almost like an intermission or something like that before the final push. The guitars and stuff do come back through later on there, but they're like a fresh texture in part because of how much they've not been there. And like we switch up and we kind of slow back down again a little bit, and we kind of saunter forward again, and we adjust our flow and representation of things rhythmically there. But it's just such a colorful piece in terms of the harmonies and melodies there, and a very different way to prior tracks, primarily because of how gentle things are in comparison. You even have that little kind of like lady vocal chop there, or like line around like the 3-minute 20 mark there, just as a different vocal texture. It's just so cool to have further things that are different in that part. It feels like its own sort of unique concept. And the strings, they rise up during this sort of guitar section with the power chords and stuff like that, and it sounds to kind of build up and kind of rise on its own. But you don't stay on the guitars even for that long at that point. It's like we're cognizant of the fact that just because we've introduced them for the first time in a few minutes doesn't necessarily mean that they need to last another 5. They step away, you've got the choirs, and you're genuinely wondering what's happening next. Granted, I'm still not entirely convinced about that guitar line and amongst the double kick section at the end there, with the way that it kind of modulates itself up a half step in order to be able to kind of do this kind of flat second orient. I think it's a kind of raunchy, edgy thing that kind of insinuates that the Undying, something menacing is going to occur there. That's how I'd kind of interpret that again, especially with the lack of vocals. But ultimately, nonetheless, intriguing music there, and it's because of how tight we've been with our note choices, our harmonies, the way we sort of like design our progressions and stuff like that, that I feel that kind of bit of quirkiness and dissonance with those note choices is clearly a deliberate thing. It's letting you know, hey, we've had a bit of a relaxing time at this point, but things are about to get crazy again. So fascinating structurally. I just feel like we take our time with this one. It's a lot more kind of relaxed and free flowing in a song where there's been a lot of heaviness, and you've definitely gotten your taste of it. But it's just nice to have that sort of adjustment of intensity there, especially at the halfway point, especially after some quite long songs, and you feel like you're ready for more. Ultimately, I think thematically it's minor leaning. It's a similar chord key signature, I think, for all of these tracks, but we do have some chromatics and deliberate kind of like manipulations of things, and ultimately I feel it's quite satisfying. It's ultimately more about the journey you go through this one as opposed to trying to have like one singular concept and have that repeat, and I think that's been the joy of this music in general throughout this album. From a studio production perspective, I think as a final note, it's just great to hear a variety of different new instruments that we have within it. Like, we're still including different types of vocal takes, we're still including different types of synthesizers, we're not taking the listener's attention for granted, and those things are continuously being put in a way where it's kind of very sort of like satisfying to listen to. There's still a dynamic range, and we also know to kind of lower the relative intensity of things from a loudness perspective in those low-key sections, especially at this part of this track, even though there are some accents and stuff like that. We've just got our ceiling sorted with a limiter and compression, and we're just like serving, and it's great, honestly. There, it's just nice to have that adjustment. I'm looking forward to the rest of the album. We have the Undying, track number 6. That was an interesting, hang on. Oh, I think that was following on from the previous one, right? Very little flourish at the end there with the guitars. Great push with the kicks. Unusual note choices there, right? can hear how the bass was coming up with those guitars there. Great to hear the unison between them melodically. Oh, that's heavy. I don't really know if we've gone that low in their range before. Is this the first cleanish guitar we've had in this entire album? I wasn't expecting a saxophone solo. That sorry to pause. That's again, I like the way it was phrased. I like the melody of it. I can just imagine if you had like an actual saxophone in there, that would have sounded really cool. I did like it, but I feel like you could just I just think I'm a fan of saxophone, to be fair. It's like one of my favorite instruments. Kind of Moorish, some of those note choices. This is such a gentle reinterpretation of that initial melody on the flutes. So that was the Undying, track number 6 off of this album. I'm assuming potentially it just with the amount of compositional diversity and different styles, the different colors and moods and everything, I'm starting to stress a whole lot of different things in regard to the Undying there. It's a complicated environment that it presides in. Structurally, you know, because of a lack of absence of vocals, we can't really comment on that too much. I think we did have like the lady vocalist thingy come back in though, like around the saxophone part. That was kind of neat. I'm glad that they're having more time in the sun. I like the choirs, but it's nice to have different vocal textures and timbres in the mix as well. I think that's really neat. Very different track though at 6:43. I did like that we had some new elements such as the saxophones and some of the flutes and the clean guitars. We're still experimenting with new colors in our toolbox and it's great. You know, again, I think it's just so interesting to me that like we had that moment where I was like, are we going to have this for the album? And then we completely flipped things and did things differently. We come into the track in a very familiar place, granted with the double kicks and the fill there, the kind of chugged guitar chords and sort of string skipped parts and melodies. And that's just kind of letting us know, hey, you're in familiar territory at this point. But it doesn't stay on that for too long. I think it's trying to sort of illustrate or sort of suggest that there is a change coming, you know, and we like, you know, do double times and sort of single times and adjust our kind of phrasing of the double kicks there and sort of speed things up as needed. The bass guitar, as I mentioned, rises up with the guitar note wise there and maintains a great sense of unison with that and knows when to behave and when to move. But there are also some unusual notes on the guitar parts that I heard there, some notes outside of the main sort of like scales that I appreciated. It was kind of menacing and kind of feral at times, but I kind of dig that we're kind of adding a bit of edge there with some unexpected notes. It's such a nice foil, especially when you consider how gentle the guitars are. Those clean sort of picked guitars around that 2.5 minute mark there, just on that left side there by themselves. They're so fragile and delicate. They're such a wonderful adjustment from the heaviness of the stuff before, the darkness before. And we have this almost kind of like underwater kind of atmosphere, like a lot of instruments that I've heard in like video games that have underwater monuments and stuff. There's this kind of chorus and kind of cuteness to it, the gentle nature that goes alongside the lady vocals in that part. Like the stereo field fills up with all these different elements in that part, and you've got the drums that come back in, but they're nowhere near as frenetic as or ferocious as they were before, primarily because Sorin Sage knows not to do that at that part. You need to adjust as needed. You need to create these atmospheres and maintain them. Again, I wasn't necessarily totally convinced with the tone of the saxophone or the brass instrument around that solo section, but I did like the phrasing of it, as well as the occasional use of chromatics there, some legato technique, the triplet patterns, the staccatos, etc. It was kind of peppy and exciting, and again, it was just a lush like change and a contrast to a lot of the elements we had, especially at the start of this track alone. And again, we don't stay on that sort of like atmosphere or quote-unquote vibe for too long. We do go back to the chugs with the choirs and everything like that, but it's just nice to still be experimenting with different combinations at this late stage of the album. And we do, to be fair, go back to those kind of softer, more ambient textures there with the kind of like the wispy kind of noisy parts, the reverbs, the ethereal kind of mist that echoes around the 5.5 minute mark. Almost like some heavily box reverbed or chamber reverbed guitar parts there, like really kind of filling out the stereo field neatly. And I think what's kind of neat is that you have the bass being presented with its full form, but then the guitars are kind of like washed out a little bit in a way that's very different to prior. We really are trying to sort of turn a page, I think. The flutes that come in, they repeat a certain kind of like leitmotif that we had earlier, but in its form factor and its texture. And it's less kind of like brittle, like it's less kind of like peppy sounding than the brass that we had earlier. So it's just a nice sort of alt lead there that kind of soaks things up. And like everything is relatively like low key and sparse at that point, even though it's quite sort of like kind of like well kind of balanced. It's just we have a lot of different emotions expressed here. But we're very comfortable with our reverbs and delay tails and stuff in this piece there. We're comfortable with our fundamental instruments that we've had so far, as well as presenting new things. It's great to structurally have these different elements and transfers be so clean. And it's nice for it to be nice and tight without any filler and without a note out of place. Thematically, minor leaning as per, but like it's not too kind of dark or kind of like gritty or like uncomfortable or like kind of, it's not like thrashing your head the entire time. It's almost like we've kind of realized that we've had a consistency with the heaviness throughout a few of the earlier tracks, and we really are trying to add more sort of dynamic range to this piece, both from a compositional and a production perspective. There are some chromatics and unusual note choices in certain parts there, but ultimately it does stick with that minor, and I think it does does a good job of doing so. It's one of the things that helps to tie this track together is the key signature. I think that maybe if the key signatures had been too different, it would have maybe just sounded a little bit alien. It's just like goes to show the amount of utility and sort of creativity involved here in order to make each track different despite the same key signature, and a similarity in terms of the chord progressions that we used there with a similar pattern, phrasing, and bass line and sequencing there. Like there are some transitions between the harmonies that I recognize from other tracks, but it's just different combinations on top that reinvent them. And I feel like we've gotten a lot of real estate out of these, especially with the form factor of these tracks. Ultimately, yeah, not satisfying. Studio production wise, it was just great to hear the panning of the guitar on its left at the side. It was nice to have that different representation of the guitar tone playing those kind of extended chords. There's those individual picked parts there, how quiet they were, how well things kind of came in once you had the kind of ox takes with the other sort of like peppered kind of guitar parts as well on the other side. It was just wonderful to have the changes in loudness while still being relatively well balanced and nice and loud with it without too much pumping when it needed to be in the heavier sections. It just sounded quite well balanced. Yeah, honestly really happy with the production in general throughout this album. It's been really intriguing. We've got track number 7 titled Soul Reaper. Great use of blast beats here. I do quite like that one. Great adjustment to the toms here. Pretty sure they could be kicks. I'm out of practice with this headbang stuff. My neck's getting kind of sore. I suppose that's a compliment, right? All kind of ravish, right? It's interesting to have the leads at the same rhythm as those. Oh no, never mind. It's so subtle. Nice. It's crazy to think these songs are like the length of 2 to 3 songs within themselves, you know? It's just such a wonderfully beautiful moment. Almost becoming cinematic at this point. And then that is Soul Reaper, track number 7. Again, a vastly varied track with its own sort of concepts within a similar sort of key signature to the rest of it, but that goes through so many really interesting changes. Honestly, you don't need vocals with this. There's enough going on with the lead layers and choirs and guitars and bass and drums and everything like that to be able to sort of see you through, even though it is in a longer form factor at 7 minutes, half minutes. They just seem like they kind of fly by at this stage. Like, not entirely. Like, there are moments where I'm like, oh, this section, but then the moment I start thinking, is there going to be another section, just another one comes up. It's like they're very sort of like aware of how long to have things. You have almost like an at the gates kind of approach to a lot of this track, especially with the really fast chugging and alternate picking. I really enjoyed that kind of part there. Just sounded filthy to me. I like the speed and kind of like the kind of distortion there and the grip behind it. But it was just cool to have the track kind of start with a tom fill. I don't think we've had the track start with like an extended one like that. There have been some really interesting drum fills as well throughout this album. I dig the fact that the drums are allowed to have their own time in the sun, as well as the bass, for example, in track number 2. It's nice that these supporting instruments have their own sort of moments to be appreciated. But we have a lot of the similar kind of guitar idea, the single string kind of the harmonized dual rhythms and stuff like that as prior. It's a part, it's a staple of the album at this point, and you're either into it or you're not. I like it. I think it's nice and colorful. There's just enough diversity again compositionally with these later tracks, especially to kind of keep it compelling and refreshing when you hear it again. I think there's some adjustments, to be fair, of grooves there. Da-dun-dun, da-dun-dun. There's some syncopated and kind of like 16th kind of riffs there, which kind of change the low end of some of these elements there. There's also some tremolo picking at the lower range of the guitar at some points. We're not just doing the da-da-dun-dun the entire time by any means. We have different riffs from different styles of metal in order to sort of like flesh things out. And we do explore the instrument quite well. And there's of course the lead elements there that dance on over top. There's like an extended solo if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, I think there was a part around like the 2.5 minute mark or the 2:40 mark where I was thinking that why was the lead guitar solo the same speed, but then they switched to 16th triplets and it just absolutely just kind of flew off from there, and I knew I was silenced. But it's just great to have more melodic leads in addition to the shred, and to not like just have like fast guitar a lot of the time there. Now, granted, at this point, clearly that isn't the case, but still, if that was within isolation, you just appreciate the range in terms of the implementation of it. It's good to have this kind of da-da-da-da-da-da, these kind of main melodies that are reinstated in different parts of this track, specifically, let alone others, played on different instruments, such as the kind of really kind of trancey synthesizer that you have, the fuzziness of it. Very kind of like EDM-ish. There's like lots of fun synths within this album, but just the way it dances around with very little else going on at that stage is neat. It's cool to have a bit of fluffiness there and have a lack of intensity from the percussion at points to allow things to kind of hover for a moment. I think we do actually also have a tempo change, if I'm not mistaken, around like the 3-minute mark, which is interesting because I don't think we've had that kind of slow down there. That kind of slight lowering of the tempo there just makes it sound a bit heavier and kind of has a bit more kind of oomph to it. You know, it helps you to appreciate the speed of what happened before, but you can just kind of like be surrounded in the fire, I suppose, for lack of a better word. The choirs come in to sort of further articulate the higher end of it, but it's all about the kind of chug in that element, as well as some of the color from the guitar parts out and within the melodies and stuff like that. And we have like some interesting sub-layerish parts there around like the 4:30 mark there, where like there's like a subtle lead kind of playing some of the melodies that we've had in earlier parts, as well as I think in other parts of the album, to be fair. There are some arpeggios that are familiar at the stage and repeated, but they're presented again, as I've said, in different instruments. And just to have that as such a subtle thing is almost like a callback to previous elements of the album. And to have that kind of dance up in the upper layer, maybe flourish a bit more and spread its wings, is neat as well. It's nice to pitch shift the different leads to different elements in different areas and help them to sort of explore and sort of invigorate things. What I liked especially about this track though, one of the highlights for me was that extended string section at the end. It was just so neat to have them harmonize and cascade by themselves, to kind of adjust their flowing, to get a lot more quickly in that cinematic element I mentioned there, to kind of dance around and be kind of very sort of like dramatic, but in a way where it kind of seems like we're building into something huge without needing to put the drums in there to kind of push it up. And you have other synths that come in along those lines and play different rhythms, and it sounds very complicated, but because of the way that it's kind of staircased, it's not too much all at once there. You're kind of led by the nose a little bit, but you appreciate the journey you're having during that process. And there's like brasses as well as the strings there, and it's pure symphony at that stage. And I just think if the entire 7.5 minutes of this track had been the guitar ideas we had earlier, even with the change in tempo, even with the adjustment with like the half times and null times and the guitar solo section there that we had, it's just knowing at this stage you cannot overstay your welcome with certain things. And we need to, as I've said multiple times throughout this album, not take the listener's attention for granted, even if they like the music. A great reinterpretation of things, great sense of dynamic range, especially with the come down at like the 5:30 mark there. Thematically, minor oriented again there. This is more sort of diatonically like conservative, I think. We were trying to sort of be a bit more sort of like well behaved here. It was more about the atmosphere created by the various iterations of the minor chords that we had here and the arpeggios that we had designed there across the different instruments. And that's totally fine there. We don't need to be kind of like zany with the note choices in every single track that we play. It's just the change of rhythm, the adjustments of the flow and meter of things that's really fantastic. And again, it was good to have that change of tempo there to make the minor and sort of like chugged elements a lot heavier with the zeros. It was cool. Lots of color within it in general. We don't stay on idea for too long. We move on, transfers are clean. There is dynamic range allowing for things to be less constant. And studio production, recording, mixing and mastering wise, I just like the way that the string section at the end especially was kind of fleshed out in the stereo field there, the way the things were added but they didn't overwhelm the listener there. Ultimately, it's just well calculated and well presented, and there's been no like issues so far in terms of like the studio side for me personally. I just think this is it's just been consistent quality in that regard. You know, even if the tones are occasionally a little bit unconventional, I nonetheless appreciate what we're trying to do here. I get it. I get it, you know. We got Exhumation, track number 8. Good job. Nice staging. Trying to figure out the phrasing in terms of the bars for those. Are we adjusting? It's meter, isn't it? It's like the inner bar of workings. Polymeter. Or polyrhythm? Those natural harmonics that we're using occasionally as well for like accents. I don't think it's polymeter, I just think it's just some interesting rhythmic phrasing with some offbeat starts. I'm sorry, what are we doing swing? That bass is so busy though, I like that, man. Federation leitmotif. sensational. So that was stunning. I was not expecting it to go into jazz with that kind of shuffle around the half-minute mark, or around the halfway mark, but I love it. Exhumation, track number 8. I'm wondering the Exhumation led to a more chill time. It was a completely different vibe to anything that we've had. I mean, like, granted, there were some tracks that kind of hinted at like a lighter kind of flow of feel to it, but to really commit to the bass solo there, that kind of movement there, the shuffle, they're going to swing on the drum kit was great. It was just a fun concept. It's fantastic storytelling. Again, as I mentioned, and I'm repeating myself at this point, but just we're so good at not needing vocals to tell a story. You can kind of get the title and you can listen to the song and kind of figure out, oh, okay, I understand what he's trying to do there. I get that, you know. And granted, the track starts, you know, structurally at 5 minutes 50. It starts with a lot of what we're familiar with, those cascading like lead melodies there on top there, those tapped elements there that are slower, and you kind of have that grandiose kind of guitar, bass, and drum combination there that we're very familiar with. And we speed up and go into the kind of new middle-ish kind of dual guitar harmonies and stuff like that. And there's adjustments of the flow and rhythm and cadence and phrasing of those and different ideas that are presented. And we make great use of natural harmonics, if I'm not mistaken there. I like those stops, those kind of adjustments of meter and feel as well, though. We play with rhythm with the rhythm guitars there, and we kind of have them kind of go for like 3 beats, and then we kind of like start a loop, and then we kind of come back and we're on ourselves with the harmonies. And it's just kind of neat for the drums to be a foil alongside it, kind of pushing forward regardless. As we go between those kind of chugged halftime parts there, those kind of breakdown-ish elements there, we do have enough diversity compositionally to keep us going, even though we are familiar with those guitar parts at that stage. And there's just a lot of energy and excitement as things sort of dance around. We really are trying different ideas, such as structural at the end with the jazzy inferences, as we go back into the sort of guitar, to be fair, at the end. But it's just nice to kind of be tying both together in an aligned concept. And that kind of main melody, it gets presented in different instruments across different ranges and octaves and stuff like that through the piece to help tie it all together. You know, whether it's leads or whether it's the kind of like clean guitar parts that we have later on the piece there. It's just fun. It's nice to have that cleaner guitar in amongst the bass and sort of those saxy kind of like synth elements later on with the. It's just cool. But like, there's a little kind of sax solo-y part even with the shuffle, to be fair. I think that da-da-da-da-da-da-da gets reintegrated once you go back to the traditional straight 4/4. But just the kind of bounciness, dun-da-dun, dun-da-dun, with like the lower bass, I suppose, the electric bass, maybe even like a double bass put in there. It's just cool, dude. It's just such a surprise. It's such a contrast to what we had earlier. I think contrast is a word I've used a lot in this, but that differentiation is important when you're used to the sound of the stage. It means that you can still surprise people in the late stages. And so for Remnants, I have absolutely no idea where we're going with that one, especially at 10 minutes. But yeah, no, the chugged power chords come through neatly. There's a great sort of, great things are stacked well with the guitar layers. The bass is nice and tight, has room to breathe again, that sort of like swingish kind of like lead layer with the shuffle drums. It's nice to have an adjustment to the drums and how they're interpreted. It was a bit of a blunt transition back to the straight 4/4, but I understand what we were trying to accomplish there. If we'd just gone swing for the rest of it, it might have been like a little bit kind of strange, but we kind of reinvent and reintegrate back into that and bring the distorted guitars back in for that final finish, that final push, and you feel like you kind of had that exhumation occur, and then you're kind of back into the fray for the final battle. So it's quite well considered in terms of like there being a main melodic concept and it being presented in different matters and fashions there. You get different atmospheres and emotions portrayed through it, different levels of softness and harshness there. A great mixture of half time, normal time, and occasional double time there. The drums are wonderfully kind of proficient there, and I like the different tones and textures they have inclusive of this track as well as the others. And we have like more subtle elements such as, again, the choirs and certain elements there, and some really kind of pristine sounding pads in the more low-key sections there with the tapped clean guitar parts and the sax kind of like offering a warm kind of like cute kind of like aesthetic to the shuffle bits. So sub layers and main layers are considered. Things harmonize neatly. Thematically, minor leaning there. You're just reimagined through different elements within the piece there. It's about the diversity, the change of the different riffs. We don't have the same baseline of chord progression the entire time, to be fair. It's just that the melody is like put forward again and again in a way where it can be recognized. And I still maintain that it does mirror some of the other elements of the piece there, kind of creating an overall sort of like connecting concept throughout the album. But ultimately it does still sound quite refreshing at the stage, especially with that sudden sort of like shift we had in the later part of this one. Studio recording, mixing and mastering. Just again, great to hear different guitar techniques such as the natural harmonics being presented within the piece there. It was nice to have a change of intensity within that kind of low key section. It was great to have the shuffle kind of like meld into the rest of the elements without it being too blunt. I kind of like the fact that we weren't as subtle in a sense going into the shuffle, because it's just something we haven't had before. We had one track where we were very slow with our progression into the keys, and we're just knowing we can just do things differently and doing parts for effect. But ultimately, yeah, just solid the whole way around. Really smooth performance. You had more oomph in that last section with the guitars coming in. There was a nice natural build to it. No complaints. Because we've got Remnants, track number 9. Oh, sounds kind of dangerous, doesn't it? Oh man, the brass and the strings on top sound great. Ferocious. Great transition to the rides there. Yep, nice inclusion of extra guitar there. I have heard that riff before in a song. I'm glad that we went away from that, because that I do recognize that riff from a track I have. Kind of cool, but just, yeah, you gotta be really careful with that stuff. Yep. Great development of the strings here as well. I think the strings do help color it here and distinguish it. So how are we going to end this? How are we going to end this album? Bass. Oh, there's guitar in it. You can hear the bass down the bottom. Interesting pregnant pause there. Or pause there. Great expansion. Great pizzicato interpretation of that initial theme. Fantastic. Really happy with that, eh? Really good. Really solid track, dude. Really solid album. And that was it. That was Remnants, track number 9 off of Bloodthirst, an album from Sorin Sage. I feel like this was just a great sort of culmination of a lot of what we've had earlier throughout this piece. I'm not entirely sure how it concludes it. It has a nice finish to it with that final key pattern at the end. And with a lack of narrative context, don't necessarily understand what to make of it necessarily, aside from to appreciate what you had going on within it. The track starts nicely enough with a mixture of key patterns there, and we explore that range quite neatly. And it's very kind of delicate and pristine sounding, especially with those reverb tails on it. You know, it's well presented. You don't have those big kind of guitar, bass, and drum parts coming until a bit later on. At this stage, we're familiar with the fact that we don't always get that straight away, and that we do have some adjustment there structurally. Given the track is 10 minutes long, I don't necessarily mind that we're taking a while to come in to the main sort of guitar, bass, and drum parts because of the brass and how the strings interact with it and how sort of grandiose and huge it gets to before that point. Again, it has this kind of these orchestral drums and thumps there, as well as we kind of get ready for the final push, you know, and it sounds massive there, and the stereo field is filled with these bright elements there, and there's this sense of kind of like something massive is going to happen, in part due to just how we've been trained with movie soundtracks and stuff like that. Coming into the point where you have the guitar, bass, and drums after that final kind of rise, you have these blast beats, and it's just incredibly quick. It's like a lot of what we've had in terms of the main guitar ideas, and it's like the conclusion and entirety of them at the same time. So if you liked the main sort of colorful rhythm guitar lines that you've had throughout previous parts of the track, you're gonna like this. You're gonna like this part. You know, you have halftime parts where we sort of mix in some double kicks, and we have those kind of anthemic lead guitars on top there with the choirs and everything like that, as proposed to a lot of the other parts of the album. So that's familiar territory. There's not a lot of really different things here. I mean, the pizzicato kind of keys there, that section around 7.5 minute mark, was really sweet sounding. I liked the way that it represented some of the initial kind of melodies in a different way there to kind of make it its own. And moving into it, there was this kind of riff though that kind of reminded me of At the Gates, or As I Lay Dying, or something along those lines there. It was so close to that riff, and I'm not going to go on about it too much because I know I mentioned it during the listening process, but it's just in these situations where I think if we had vocals, it might have caused issues, partially because we might have been trying to tell a different story. It's almost like by having the riff, it keeps it kind of open. But outside of that though, I do appreciate the switch between the triplet feel and the straight 4/4 that we have in other parts there. It's just seamless transitions throughout, and to go in from that at the 5-minute 40 mark to suddenly go into something a lot softer is not an unusual thing with this album. We have heard that happen before. Things become a bit more low-key. It's not even necessarily that the kind of clean guitars and the low end are an unusual thing, because we've had them prior, although to be fair, they're in the mid-range. Having the bass thick and full in the low end with the kind of fuzz and kind of sizzle to it is nice, and the rim shots as well, a lighter kind of texture on the drum kit as opposed to the snare, was cool. The keys coming in representing a similar tone and texture to what we had at the start of the piece, helping to tie those together. Some kind of Strymon-esque kind of guitar stuff's happening with this, that kind of tapping stuff as well, which is cool. But yeah, I do like how we have the pizzicato, as I mentioned there. It's just a nice kind of representation, alternate to it. It's a new thing we haven't had yet. And even though it wasn't a massive shift like when we had that kind of jazzy section a while back, or in the previous track, it's still, I think if we'd had a massive change here, it might have been a little bit kind of confusing, I suppose. Why are we suddenly switching things at the end when we can't conclude it further? To have that final push with the distorted guitars, the leads as well, rhythms on top, the bass and drums there, to have everything kind of culminate at the end with that big finish though, I think is sensible, with some synths as well kind of fizzing along on the sides there to kind of make it sound intense in the mid-range. And you feel like you've had enough at that stage. You kind of get a feeling you've gone through the album, you've experienced all the different tastes and pleasures that it provides, and you have the pizzicato finish you out, and then you're done. You're effectively done there. You have that kind of fade out, and it's finished. That the song has ended at 10 minutes. And structurally, they have different ideas. I think if you listen to any of these tracks in isolation, you'd appreciate them structurally. Together as an album, there are consistencies that you can sort of piece together between them, I think, partially to make it so that it does kind of sound like an album. I think if these tracks had been any longer, they would have been too long. But I also kind of feel like most of these tracks do benefit from the extra length because of the amount of different things that Sorin Sage has actually managed to put in there. And I appreciate that. Ultimately, though, I think that the instruments themselves, whether they're the strings, the brass, the piano, the guitar, bass, and drums, are well represented in terms of the melodies and harmonies and rhythms that they play, a variety of different quarters, eighths, and sixteenths. We don't go thematically too far outside the diatonic with this one, I don't think so. It's effectively more well-behaved. I think we'll go for a more kind of quote-unquote wholesome experience with this one, where it's just kind of rounding out without too many harsh edges or kind of false notes. Ultimately, you get to the end of the piece with the choirs included there, assuming it's minor there, and it ends on like a sad note, but then you kind of feel like it's just come to a close in a way that it wants to regardless. Like, it's not sad because something's gone horribly wrong, it's just sad because the entire situation is kind of minor oriented. It still sounded really cool. I did like the variety of different instrumental performances and components within Remnants, in the same way that I appreciated the others, even though there was less sort of range stylistically through the composition. Ultimately, it was more the kind of symphonic elements here that were precedent, and I'm fine with that. It made the most of its 10 minutes from a studio recording, mixing, and mastering perspective. I just think having the song have that kind of quietness at the end, though, after that final chord there, was good. In that middle section, it was nice having a pause there just to be able to appreciate that there was a change in direction, especially if we weren't necessarily sure compositionally how to go between those two parts. That kind of change in lean there was neat. And ultimately, nice and loud pumping, no issues with leveling or EQing or anything like that. It's another solid addition to this album, and we're going to talk about it more in the conclusion. Because welcome to the conclusion of my review of this album from an act named Sorin Sage, titled Bloodthirst. In this section, I'm going to provide an overall analysis of the album from lyrics and vocals all the way through to studio production, as well as any applicable constructive critique, and then finally my general thoughts from a listener's perspective. But first of all, what do we think this album is about? Ultimately, I think that given the titles of the song and the fact that this is an instrumental album, I can only assume it's about an entity such as the art there, kind of dealing with the purgatory that they're in there, the afterlife or ruin, maybe being the soul reaper themselves there, that the sanctuary they're trying to find, dealing with their cravings and everything like that. I'm just not sure beyond that what to make of it. It's open to interpretation, so I think that's kind of a beautiful thing in instrumental music, and I'm sure that people will have different experiences listening through this, and I think that's totally fine. So with an absence of vocals and with the songs themselves needing to do the storytelling, you effectively have 9 tracks that range between 5 and 13 minutes, and they're very long for songs. And I've given each of these tracks their own sort of mini conclusions to discuss my individual thoughts on them, specifically Bloodthirst being the first. There's probably a bit more heft to that simply because there was a lot of new stuff to absorb. But typically, I felt like the things that we included there made sense. I thought that each of the tracks were structurally very diverse for the most part, and ultimately I'm happy with my time listening through these pieces. I think that they're wonderfully sort of sophisticated in terms of the approach to the composition themselves. We have a variety of different ideas across a range of different instruments. We do play with some interesting note choices and chromatics, and outside of diatonic occasionally. Our rhythm sections are absolutely splendid, and ultimately I think we have dynamic range to the piece as well. And just to kind of give a preface of some of my favorite instruments / the ones that I've heard through these pieces, is, again, I've spoken with the individual examples per individual instruments. You know, there's a lot of music within this album. The guitars within this album were primarily focused on either distorted rhythm playing with the chugs or palm mutas or alternate kind of parts there, breakdowns. There was some galloping, there was some normal double time and half time stuff. There was some string skipped kind of dual harmony elements there where play different notes or minor intervals or major intervals on each side there, a la kind of mid-2000s metalcore / early 2010 stuff. And we had wonderfully finessed kind of tapped lead arpeggios, shreddy solos there, sweep picking, etc. But we also had more sort of like low-key melodic solos there where we took our time a little bit, added a bit of vibrato there. There were some interesting pinch harmonics as well as some natural harmonics in parts. I think we used some interesting note choices outside of the major and minor scales as well, some extensions of chromatics there. But we also had occasional like quiet, kind of like clean guitars there with some strum and kind of reverbs or just simply dry takes on the left left. And I kind of dig the fact that it was a rare thing there. It kind of made you feel like we were evolving as we were going through the piece. Ultimately, though, the guitars were well represented. There were a variety of different styles of guitar playing, albeit there are some that are far more common than others that you become very familiar with within a short frame of time, but they never felt overplayed or overdone. And around the midpoint of the album, around track 5, things switch up quite a bit structurally, and you do wonder what happened, and you kind of realize they knew exactly when to sort of spice things up. And the guitars were not there the whole time either. I appreciate that the drums were as fiery and spicy as they were. There was one track where there were some electronic drums I wasn't necessarily sure about with the swing groove there, but ultimately I'm still kind of happy with how they were done there. It just was a bit of a quirky kind of texture that I wasn't really able to sort of piece the purpose of, but nonetheless it was totally fine. The vast majority of the time we had a more traditional kind of like metal drum kit with a variety of different toms, snares, kicks, and cymbal patterns there. We explored the drum kit really well. There were some blast beats, there were some halftime chugs, there were occasional kick patterns moving us up. Sometimes there was a bit of swing grooves and stuff like that, but very, very occasionally. Most of the time it was straight 4/4. And we were adept at doing our own beats and syncopated. There was never a kick out of place. And the machine gun kicks we had in some parts, they were so quick. But we also knew when not to have kicks. The guitars and drums were purposeful. The bass guitar was mainly a supportive layer, although you could hear it have its own little solo sections in other parts. I liked the fact that it rose with the guitars and went down to sort of fulfill the root notes, but also it did some cooler responses occasionally and some really fun stuff there from a performance perspective. The bass, it was nice. It was just well presented. It had an interesting tone. I think you could hear it like for the first time clearly within track number 2 there. And although initially I wasn't really sure of the tone, I got behind it eventually. I could sort of finesse and figure it out. The keys that were presented typically played sort of minor and major triads and arpeggios, although they play some extensions occasionally, explored the scale a little bit. There are adjustments and sort of like parallel majors and other interesting note choices there. And we did perform it as like a pseudo lead, but it was never too much. It was more of a kind of a way of representing the existing arpeggios or chord progressions in a different way. And I appreciate that. Sometimes the keys would be handled, that'd go with the guitars, bass and drums. The other times they'd go with the strings, where there were a mixture of pizzicato, kind of short pluck stuff, but we also had some grandiose string sections where we were very sort of comfortable having those full rich harmonies, either by themselves or in addition to the brass elements there. We had a variety, like I think we had like a trumpet or sax solo at one point in one of the tracks, which was kind of like, it was fun. It was an interesting tone there. It was a bit peppy and I wasn't necessarily initially sure of the tone of it, but nonetheless I did appreciate its existence in post there. And I just, especially as you get through the album, you start to understand why they made the earlier decisions. Just the way that we had the brass interact with guitars, bass, drums, or the strings of the piano, or everything else is really neat. I should note as well, while I remember, that there were vocals, but they were like choir ones, or they were like the female lady vocals there. They are more of a kind of an additional melody or harmony as opposed to a storytelling device, which is why I didn't initially put them in that first section, but I'm just noting them there. They made things sound anthemic and huge sounding and added a sense of spirituality there, made it sound very sort of like mystical or fantastical. And we had a whole lot of synth basses and textures and fizzes and sequences and some fun sort of like synthy saxophones and other layers in certain parts, as well as bits of air candy. They were additive and they improved the experience, I think. I think the music might have been a little bit naked or less interesting outside of that. They also played some existing melodies or arpeggios there in the same way that some of the flute synths and other elements did so as well. Ultimately, these sub-elements there, or these alt leads, that what they did was they provided a different representation of the main sort of themes and leitmotifs in different ways. And I think that's just sensible in terms of like having a song, especially with longer form factor, make sense and still sound fresh, despite being 7 to 10 minutes in. And there's other bits of air candy that I've probably missed as well there, but almost those are the main sort of fundamental instruments there. I did typically like the way the rhythms and cadences were handled, both like in some time signatures. There were changes of tempos occasionally, there were changes of meters there were polyrhythms and polymeters. And ultimately it's really well written music. Thematically, traditionally minor oriented. There were some parts where there were chromatic notes outside of it, some extension chords, some 6th or 7th or something like that. But ultimately it was for effect, or it was simply to change the sort of quote unquote vibe of a piece. It never felt alien or disingenuous or sort of strange. And effectively, I'm just really happy with it. But I think that, like, considering the subject matter, it makes total sense that things are minor oriented. So I've got no complaints about that either. Things are sensible. Yeah, from a studio recording, mixing and mastering perspective, it's just the change in ambience and atmosphere with some of the more low-key sections and points of pause that allowed us to experience different, like, shades of that minor orient, which I appreciate, We were creative with it. Studio recording, mixing, and mastering, the different choir takes, guitar, bass, drums, keys, synths, brass, strings, etc., orchestral drums, all of the air candy-ish bits, synths, they're all presented well within the stereo field and frequency spectrum. There were no resonant frequencies in the frequency spectrum. Music surrounding your stereo field, things went backwards and forwards. There was volume automation, changes in the presentation and stuff, such as when one track where kind of came down for the keys to be more present. There were occasional blunt transfers, but I think they were deliberate. And even though I wasn't necessarily on board with all the textures and timbres we had here, typically they were leveled well. There was definitely dynamic range. There were complete pauses. Nice and loud without pumping, bass compression, and limiting was handled, and just generally I think it's very, very well done. No real applicable constructive critique here. I think I've already sort of mentioned just some subjective nuance, things like not being sure about a couple of things within the track, but ultimately the vast majority of it is very positive. And from my final overall general listener's perspective, ultimately I just think this was incredibly well written, and it's a labor of love for Sorin Sage, and I adore the fact that they put this much effort into it. I wish them all the best of luck in the future with their music, and I had a great time being able to listen through this. I just appreciate that there was the variety of composition that there was within it. I just think if you played too much of the same thing, it could have been a very long hour and 9 minutes. But thank you for watching my review of this album from an act named Sorin Sage titled Bloodthirst, and hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, please do go show them some love via their various social medias and their Spotify page, and stay cool and stay safe, and please remember to support your local musicians and artists at supported time, as you need to help more than ever with all the crazy stuff going on in the world. And I'll catch you in the next SB Reacts. Spiderhands out.